Are the Indianapolis Colts trade geniuses? Does the beef over Carson Wentz's fit in Washington matter? And we discuss a potential free agent addition the Commanders may pursue now that their defensive line depth has taken a hit. All of that right now on the Locked On Commanders podcast.
Your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome in, Commanders fans, to the Locked On Commanders podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are your daily podcast covering the Washington Commanders, free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Big shout out to all of you checking us out over there. And of course, continued shout out to those of you downloading the episode daily. We thank you for making us your first listen or your first view of the day. I am David Harrison, covering the Commanders for Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation. My co-host, Chris Russell, the Rooster, one half of the Russell and Medhurst show on the Team 980. Find Chris and Pete there Monday through Friday from 3 to 7 p.m. Eastern time or anytime along with the show on the Audacy app. When we're not there, we're not here, we're on Twitter at DHarrison82, at WrestleMania621, and at LO Commanders. Once again, we thank you for making us your first listen or view of the day. Today's episode brought to you by Rock Auto. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. Visit rockauto.com and tell them that Locked On sent you, similar to the way that the Atlanta Falcons are sending Matt Ryan to the Indianapolis Colts, Chris, to replace Carson Wentz in Indianapolis and to relieve a whole lot of quarterback drama that developed very quickly, very recently in the city of Atlanta, Georgia.
Well, it's not the only city that has quarterback drama. Of course, Indianapolis did when they decided to get rid of Carson Wentz after 1 year. And how can we argue that it wasn't a failed attempt, a failed bid after Phillip Rivers retired, right? When it cost them a first-round pick, and I think it was a third-round pick, if memory serves me correct. And, of course, Carson Wentz is now the Commanders' problem, which brings this into greater focus for us, David. And I don't know how you feel, but to me, I think Indianapolis, I talked to somebody over the weekend in that building, and they said, you know, the drop-off from Phillip Rivers in terms of the leadership, in terms of the attitude, in terms of the feel in the building was noticeable when you went from Phillip Rivers to Carson Wentz. And I think they're trying to get back to that with Matt Ryan. Is Matt Ryan 6 or 7 years older? Absolutely. Is Matt Ryan as mobile as Carson Wentz is? No. Is Matt Ryan maybe even the gunslinger at this point in his career than Carson Wentz? No. But he checks a lot of the other boxes that the Colts felt like they were missing.
Right.
And I know this. I've watched Matt Ryan for most of his career. Of course, every team in the NFC South has seen him twice a year. I know Ron Rivera was fond of Matt Ryan. How could you not be? I know he didn't win a Super Bowl, but to me, if I was sizing up the two, and if I'm the Indianapolis Colts, while Matt Ryan may not be as good as Carson Wentz is in some of those areas, I know he's going to be better in some of those areas that I deemed, and I'm speaking from a Colts perspective, that I deemed that Carson Wentz fell short in, that I felt we were missing, especially down the stretch when the pressure cooker cranked up a little bit. So again, you're not going to get everything in a quarterback. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't be available via trade. Yeah. Clearly, Atlanta moving on, they take a big cap hit. But to me, I think Indianapolis got better here when you look at Phillip Rivers to Carson Wentz to Matt Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's how can you not see that, right? And I mean, every quarterback, you typically either have, elite athletic ability or elite mental processing ability. For Matt Ryan, it's always been about the mental processing, then the arm kind of comes with it. I remember when he got drafted out of Boston College to join the Atlanta Falcons, I really thought it was a very smart move at the time, 14 years ago, almost 15 years ago, when they did it, because the Falcons really were kind of the first team that I remember building a team and then inserting a quarterback into it. And like you said, it didn't produce a Super Bowl win, but it did produce a lot of very good years for the Atlanta Falcons franchise and for the fans of that organization. A lot of competitive football, the relationship between he and guys like Jamal Anderson, Julio Jones, et cetera, Tony Gonzalez. I mean, there's a lot of good football. Of course, you also have the 28-3 debacle, but look, There are a lot of NFL franchises. Look at the Detroit Lions, who've never even been in the position to have a 28-3 debacle. So there's your silver lining if you need it. But if you're the Indianapolis Colts, Chris, you just traded Carson Wentz for an improved second-round pick, a third or second-round pick next year, a better third-round pick this year, because a third-round pick they sent to the Atlanta Falcons is the worst of the 2 third-round picks that they got from the Washington Commanders. And Matt Ryan. So that's what you got for Carson Wentz. A better second, a better third, a future third, maybe second, and Matt Ryan in exchange for Carson Wentz. Chris Ballard may have just won Executive of the Year already, and we're not even out of the month of March. But for the Washington Commanders, this begs the question. We kind of talked about this. I know I talked about it while you were away when the move first happened. We've kind of touched on it. Did the Washington Commanders, in your eyes, panic when they lost on Russell Wilson and pulled the trigger too early on the Carson Wentz trade? Before you answer that, just for those listening and watching who don't know already, the original trade compensation that was being talked about with the Carson Wentz deal with the Indianapolis Colts, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, was a 6th and a 5th round draft pick.
I think it was a 6th and a 4th, but you may be right. I mean, somewhere right around that. 6th was definite.
And then when they missed on Russ, it jumped to a third, a swap of a second, and another third. That's a huge jump in a short period of time. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, and it also happened the day after the Russell Wilson trade, right? So clearly it would be hard to argue that Washington did not panic.
Yeah.
Clearly they felt, oh my gosh, nobody's going to choose us. Aaron Rodgers didn't choose us. Russell Wilson didn't choose us. There's nobody else. We can't risk Mitchell Trubisky leaving us at the altar, Jameis Winston, Marcus Mariota, so on and so forth. We like this guy. Let's do the deal. Let's give the Colts what they want. Let's take back the entire salary. They didn't have to pay any dead cap hit. Let's take on the salary. We can get out of it after a year if it doesn't work. Let's give them these draft picks, so on and so forth. And to me, the question becomes did they rush? Yes. Should they have waited? Well, that's a different question, David. And I'm curious how you think about this, because remember, that happened Wednesday, like 11 or 12 days ago.
Right.
And that's a day after the Russell Wilson deal and a day after Aaron Rodgers comes back to Green Bay. But it's 2 days before we find out that Deshaun Watson is not going to face criminal charges. And then a day or two after that, we find out all of a sudden Atlanta is in the mix here for Deshaun Watson, right? So if Washington would have even sensed that Matt Ryan was available and said, oh, hold on, we don't have to rush. Maybe we can get Matt Ryan. Maybe we view him as an upgrade more than Carson Wentz. Well, if they had done that, and if they had said that to themselves, they would have probably had to wait at least a week or so to fill out that quarterback position, that QB1 position.
Right.
And for all the things that I can criticize the Commanders organization for, I don't know if it's fair. Honestly, I don't know if it's fair for me to sit here and say they should have waited, because I understand the pressure that they felt. Could they have waited a day or two? Maybe. To ask them to wait 7, 8, 9, 10 days, whatever it was, I don't think that's fair, because they probably would have felt the need to go somewhere else in between while this whole Matt Ryan Atlanta situation sorted itself out. I'm not sure if you agree or disagree, but I can't kill them for that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna sit here and slander the Washington Commanders for not knowing that the Atlanta Falcons at the 10th hour, I don't think it was the 11th hour, but at the 10th hour are going to get into the Deshaun Watson conversation and burn the bridge that they spent 14 years building with Matt Ryan, and all of a sudden he was going to become available. That's something nobody predicted. In fact, the conversation about Matt Ryan moving off the Atlanta Falcons this offseason had already been had and was already solved, because the dead cap space alone on that contract pretty much made it prohibitive. But the Atlanta Falcons essentially decided, you know what, it's worth the risk to get Deshaun Watson. And again, I think that when you talk about an owner like Arthur Blank, who has one of the best reputations in the NFL, I think this is probably a move that when it was brought to him, it was probably the answer back was, look, if we're going to do this, it's going to be ugly. It's going to be public. We better not miss, because you know what you're doing. You're burning 14 years of Matt Ryan being an Atlanta Falcons quarterback and not complaining, not holding out, not demanding trades, not demanding this and that. And that's a very rare commodity in today's NFL. So I'm not going to murder them for that. What I will say, Chris, is I do think they should have, and I did think at the time they should have waited to see what happened with Deshaun Watson, because I was going on another podcast. I was saying on this podcast, on the Locked On Bucs podcast, as the Buccaneers, until Tom Brady came back, were rumored to be connected with Deshaun. I was saying everywhere that a microphone would be put in front of my face that Deshaun Watson was going to be the biggest domino to fall this offseason with quarterback. So anybody that had a quarterback need should wait until what Deshaun Watson was going to do, see what was going to happen with that whole situation before they pulled the trigger on something. That doesn't necessarily mean you don't still pull the trigger on Carson Wentz, and then 3 days later, like you said, Matt Ryan suddenly becomes available. So we still might end up in the same exact place. That's the only place I'll say I had an issue is wait and see what happens with the biggest influence, quarterback influence out there, which was Deshaun at the time, before you make a final decision. But but in the grand scheme of things, that's really a small nitpicky thing to say that I think you should have done differently.
I mean, that's an interesting perspective, and we can talk, of course, all day. I mean, ultimately, Washington felt the need to get something done, and they were very aggressive, too aggressive probably, in getting it done. All right, the locker room hasn't had a chance to get divided, David, over the acquisition yet of Carson Wentz. Well, because they haven't been in the locker room, but a lot of fans and media certainly have. Does any of it really matter? We talk about that in a moment, but before we talk about that madness, why don't we talk about the other madness, specifically college basketball, David?
Yeah, it's that time again. College basketball's tournament is finally upon us, and all your latest odds, contests, and player props are at betonline.net, the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season, and it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action at BetOnline, where the game starts.
All right, thanks again for making thanks again, Washington Commanders fans, is what he wanted to say, for making us your first listen and your first watch. If you're watching on YouTube, we thank you either way. Make sure you're now following the Locked On NFL podcast. We're Locked On experts covering the biggest stories around the NFL every Monday through Friday in less than 30 minutes. It's free and available wherever you get your podcast. Along with David Harrison, who's covering the Washington Commanders, PressSide.com's Fan Nation. I'm Chris Russell, co-host of the Russell and Medhurst Show on the Team 980 in Washington, D.C., and the audio app. You can follow us again at DHarrison82, at WrestleMania621, at LO Commanders, and we'll get you involved in the voicemail coming up here in just a little bit and tell you how you can further get involved in the Locked On Commanders podcast. All right, David, so the divide on Carson Wentz, again, like you said, we haven't been able to determine inside the locker room, because nobody's been in the locker room. Nobody's really been in the building. So everything's hunky-dory right now, and I assume a clean sheet. But the divide between, say, reporters and reporters doing their job, and I know, just honestly, I've been involved in some of this, and I've heard some unsavory things, quite honestly, from people in the Colts organization that are familiar with this situation. But Ron Rivera says, basically, one of his quotes is, "You have questions. Mm-hmm. I don't." And he cited, again, Darius Leonard and Jonathan Taylor, and apparently he talked to Frank Reich after the trade, and he says, you don't have to worry about this. You don't have to ask questions. You don't have to have angst over it. We got this. Is this a big deal or not a big deal in your eyes? Are we, the media, making it a big deal? And then the fans in reverse basically say, why are you so worried? Nothing's happened so far. There's nothing to see here. Yeah. No big deal. Why don't we wait until September to see how this plays out? What side of the fence should we be on, I guess?
I think, to me, it's like a weather forecast. You should be aware of it. You should know about it. You should prepare as best as you can for what the worst case scenario is coming, but you shouldn't panic over it. That's kind of how I view this whole situation with Carson Wentz. Look, the reputation is there for a reason. The reports have come out for a reason. Are there people that like him? Absolutely. He's not a pariah. He's not just an unlikable, antichrist type of figure. There are going to be people out there in his corner. Of course there are. Are there people out there that don't like him, don't feel like he's coachable, feel like maybe he's more selfish than a quarterback should be? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. The real question here is, Can he fit with this roster, this locker room, and this coaching staff? And to be quite honest with you, everything that happened in the past, like Frank Wright is not going to be the head coach of this team. Doug Peterson is not going to be the head coach of this team. Down the list, quarterback coaches, wide receivers, quarterbacks, like all this stuff, right? None of those guys are coming through the doors anytime soon for the Washington Commanders. So how Carson Wentz fits with this crew is what's important. And the lessons he's learned from the places he's been are going to influence how that happens here. From a media standpoint, when you talk about analyzing moves and analyzing players coming into the organization, all we have right now is the past. Like if people feel like we're being unfair, all we have right now is the past. So what does the past look like? Well, bottom line is, guys, 2 franchises have moved on from him because someone in the building with the power to make decisions did not like his presence as a quarterback, his selflessness for the team, and his performance when it mattered the most. Also, he's a physical upgrade over Taylor Heineke. Those are the things that we're saying. Those are things that we are talking about here on the Locked On Commanders podcast. As best I can tell from the John Kimes and the Nikki Javalas of the world, that's what they're writing. That's what they're talking about. They're very real situations and concerns, but that does not foresee, it does not necessarily write in stone his future. And where you're really going to find out if our media circle around the Commanders, Chris, has integrity is if he starts doing well. Do we then allow ourselves to praise him for doing well, or do we continue to beat this narrative of what he may or may not have been in Indianapolis and Philly while ignoring what he is in Washington? But until he starts doing something in Washington, we can't do that.
Yeah, it's interesting because something I was thinking about as you were answering that, and I think you put it in good perspective, but you talk about there's no Frank Reich, there's no Doug Peterson. Of course, his relationship, we know, with Doug Peterson soured towards the end. We don't think it did with Frank Reich, but clearly Frank Reich was overruled by somebody, whether that's Chris Ballard, whether that's Jim Irsay, doesn't know. We don't know, and maybe it doesn't matter. I wonder if maybe a clean slate for Carson Wentz, where he doesn't really know anybody here. There is no connection to Ron Rivera. There's no connection to Scott Turner. There's no connection to Ken Zampese, the quarterback's coach. He doesn't know Terry McLaurin, so on and so forth. Maybe a clean slate, maybe a totally clean canvas is the best thing for him. Yeah. And you said, if he starts to have success, will people kind of celebrate that or honor that or praise him for that and be able to get over the past? Yes, I think they will.
Yeah,
I think media, though, I think media will always keep it in the back of their mind and will always be on the hunt for things when things don't go right, bad game, bad situation, whatever it might be, bad streak. That's where he has to worry. If Carson Wentz's play is on the field, is superior, is elite, David, nobody's going to care. Nobody's going to bring it up. Nobody's going to care. Nobody's going to want to take the good times away because, quite honestly, we all benefit, right? It's clicks, it's views, it's downloads. We all want the team to succeed, no matter what people say. We all want the team to succeed. So I think where you have to watch out is when he struggles. And of course, leading up to, there'll just be stories about people that say, well, how did Carson Wentz get here? A bunch of that can be brushed under the rug. I think the real danger zone is if they go on a 2-game or a 3-game losing streak.
Yeah, and what I think, like the John Kimes of the world, I know what we're gonna do, right? But like the John Kimes of the world and the Ben Standings of the world, I think the JP Finley, et cetera. Like I can't name everybody, but I'm trying to name all the big hitters. If Carson Wentz goes out week 1 and drops 354 touchdowns, no interceptions, and rushes for another against Philadelphia Eagles in Philly, nobody's gonna write a column that says he did all these great things. But we still wonder if he's got leadership problems.
Right.
Like, you know what I'm saying? Like nobody's going to do that to him.
Let me stop you there. Are you playing NFL schedule maker?
I mean, that would be if I'm an NFL schedule maker, that's an easy week 1 matchup for me.
That's pretty simple, right?
That's Sunday night, and honestly, that's the best situation to get the Eagles and Washington on a primetime game and know that people are going to want to watch it. So to me, it's a no-brainer. But that's what I'm saying is if the criticism comes, it's going to be deserved, and it's going to be based off of things that are outside of the world that a lot of, like you got to mention, having conversations with people. There are things, and people have to, I don't say have to, but people should understand that in the world of media and journalism, and that line gets blurred a lot in this new world of new media. And guys, I mean, I'm sitting in a home office. You're sitting in a home office. We can do this. Chris, you're a very well-established multi-decade journalists in this field, but not all of us are. I've never had a full-time role as a journalist. So a lot of people have microphones and have the ability to put out information, but have to understand the tenets of journalism. And there are things that you can talk about that aren't necessarily reportable, right? And those are two differences. But these things that are talked about typically come from somewhere, right? Like I will tell you that if you go to the Locked On Bucs podcast back at the end of the 2019 NFL season, if you go through the episodes, you hear, could Jameis come back? Could Jameis come back? Could Jameis come back? Jameis is not coming back. There's a reason that conversation shifted as quickly as it did, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily a report, but it's something we're talking about. Those are the kinds of things. These things are not baseless. These things don't just come out of thin air. And there was one person on Twitter that kind of came at us together and said, it feels kind of coordinated. This attack on Carson Wentz feels kind of coordinated. Listen, Chris, I don't know if you've been in a meeting with Nikki, Ben, JP, or anybody else saying, hey, guys, we're going to bash Carson. But if you guys had that call, I was not invited. I'm offended. So at least what I can tell everybody is that my disagreement with this move is honest, because Chris is keeping me out of the loop on this media conspiracy against Carson Wentz.
Yeah, I can promise you that meeting never happened, nor is there a text thread. I mean, I'm on text threads and I have lots of meetings. That one didn't happen. But, look, fans are going to want to shape the narrative just like media is going to want to shape the narrative. So just keep all that in mind. David, we have one final segment left to go, so we'll make the turn right here and right now, and we'll try and get in as much as we possibly can. We will actually hear a voicemail from a sort of frustrated Washington Commanders fan. But first, guys, this episode is brought to you by our friends at Rock Auto and rockauto.com. Of course, there's all sorts of makes and models. And then there's all your big auto parts superstore giants that have this corporate overwhelming, space to keep up. And they've got to pay the bills, right? They've got to pay their employees. They've got to pay the rent. They've got to pay the mortgage on the building. They've got to get all the parts. Well, Rock Auto and rockauto.com doesn't charge you for that. They don't surcharge you for that. So that allows them to give you the best prices on the best auto parts, whatever you need for your car or truck. Old, new, foreign, domestic, whatever it might be, vanity or a major repair, rockauto.com is going to be your place to get the very best service and the very best price for whatever you need. So here's what we want you to do. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck, get what you need, and write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need at rockauto.com.
Final segment here of the Locked On Commanders podcast for today. David Harrison and Chris Russell on Twitter at RussellMania621. I'm at DHarrison82, the show at LO Commanders. Chris, we're going to talk about whether or not Star Lotulelei, veteran defensive lineman, would be a good fit with the Washington Commanders after losing both Tim Settle and Matt Ioannidis. But before we do that, let's bring in Lawrence to air his grievances, so to speak, of the Carson Wentz deal.
I just called previously. My name is Lawrence McDonald. I'm a longtime fan. Been a fan since I was born in 1964. I don't think Wentz makes us a better team. I think it's going to be very divisive in that locker room. He's going to have his guys that are with him and guys that aren't. As I said before, I believe we could have did better in some aspects. If you put the pieces in place, you're not needing a great quarterback. But what you do need is someone that has the mental capacity to bring a team together, and I don't think he can do that. From the beginning, I didn't like Ron Rivera as our coach. I think we needed another one. I think he's going to pay the price, as I said before, and I think it's going to be warranted. Every season he sounds a little desperate, and that shows his hand, and that's why we're in the position that we're in, and we have been. So with that said, I'm hoping for the best, but I'm a cynic when it comes to putting round pieces in square pegs. Square pegs and round holes. And I think that's exactly what he did. He's trying to force an issue that just won't happen. Thank you.
All right, Lawrence, thank you for the voicemail. We appreciate it. Some strong, passionate takes there. I don't know if I would go so far as he did, David, but again, you see a lot of fans defending Carson Wentz and Ron Rivera and the need for a quarterback, and then you see Lawrence, who basically has the opposite point of view. So we appreciate the contributions. As always, we will continue to mix in all of your thoughts as quickly as we can get them. David, you mentioned just a moment ago, Washington might be in on chasing a former Ron Rivera disciple on the defensive line, somebody who was just cut by the Buffalo Bills, Star Lotulelei, now, again, a free agent. He could possibly replace Matt Ioannidis and or Tim Settle. What say you? Would you be in favor of going the route of the Star?
I think it's a plant. I think that Brandon Beane put him out there to get Washington to try to sign him so that they can then swoop in before he signs and bring him back. That's what I think. No, I don't actually think that's what's happening. But look, I mean, yeah, you need defensive line depth. You know what I mean? And obviously familiarity is a big thing. It makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. And again, Starr is a guy who's established, so you know that he's going to bring the right kind of energy if you're bringing him in for that reason. I like it. I just also think that they also need to get a little bit younger. I think they need to pursue it's a very talented defensive line group. You need to pursue some of those players in the NFL draft. But what it does do, it adds a little bit more flexibility to your draft strategy when it comes to executing your picks, because you don't feel like you have to go that direction and maybe end up reaching as a result.
Yeah, I think he would be a part-time player here, clearly, because of Jonathan Allen and because of Daron Payne. Yeah. And I also think if he was such a stud still, like he once used to be, that Beane and Sean McDermott wouldn't have let him go when they had a couple of openings in that interior defensive tackle position. One of them they clearly filled with Tim Settle, but now they have another one that they created by this release. Still, I think a worth it shot if it's a 1 year, couple of $1 million type deal, maybe with an incentive structure. If you got to do a multi-year deal, no thanks. All right, that's going to do it for us Commanders fans. We appreciate you being with us each and every day right here on the Locked On Commanders podcast, and for making us your first listen of the day and also your first watch on YouTube. Now make your second listen and watch the Locked On NFL Draft podcast with Ryan Tracy and former NFL cornerback Eric Crocker, as they bring the NFL draft to life each and every day with insight and analysis on college football prospects and NFL front offices. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts. I'll be back with a solo edition, and then David will be back with a solo edition, and then we'll reconvene before the end of the week for another tag team edition of the Locked On Commanders podcast. If you want to get in, Locked On Washington Commanders at gmail.com, Locked On Washington Commanders at gmail.com, or 301-615-3577. That's 301-615-3577 on the voicemail like Lawrence did. For David Harrison, who's covering the Washington Commanders for SI.com Fan Nation, I'm Chris Russell of the Russell and Medhurst Show on the Flagship Station for the Washington Commanders, the Team 980, and the Audacy app. If you're out and about, please be safe, be kind to one another. Thank you for joining us, and happy World Down Syndrome Day. Monday, March 21st, my son has Down syndrome. Very important day. Please keep that in mind. Please think about a Down syndrome child or family. Thanks for joining us right here on the Locked On Commanders podcast.